Hello, and welcome to Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate. Here's our host, Cherish Badzinski.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Exploring Intersections. This program is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Throughout this year, we're talking with expert panelists about some of the biggest social issues of our time. If you have missed our past programs, you can watch them on YouTube or download a podcast version. Today, our panel conversation centers on economic justice. Economic justice is the idea that the economy will be more successful if it's fairer, that prosperity and justice go hand in hand rather than in opposition to one another. It's an economy built on sustainable growth, because a down economy hits the poor and marginalized the most. It's about funneling economic gains to people rather than profits, primarily in the form of wages. And it's about building an economy that works for the common good. To help us better understand today's topic, we are joined by three panelists. Dr. Kim Lamberty has been developing and managing faith-based justice, peace, cross-cultural, and community service programs for more than 25 years. She is currently Director of Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation at the Society of the Sacred Heart, United States and Canada Province. She is also founder and president of Just Haiti, a fair trade company that focuses on economic justice for vulnerable small-scale farmers, and co-owner of Conscious Coffees, another fair trade company. Kim specializes in root causes of poverty, especially relating to economic justice and consumption. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me.
Elizabeth Garlow is a fellow on faith and finance at the New America Foundation and co-founder of the Francesco Collaborative, a network of investors, entrepreneurs, and changemakers drawing upon Catholic social teaching to transform the economy. Previously, Garlow helped lead impact investing for Lumina Foundation, where she invested in early stage ventures focused on designing new and more equitable education and work pathways. She previously served as a policy advisor with the Obama administration's Community Solutions Task Force, where she managed the President's Promise Zones initiative. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's a gift to be here. Thank you.
Jake Barnett is Director of Sustainable Investment Stewardship for WestPath and its subsidiaries' investment programs, leading WestPath's shareholder advocacy and engagement efforts. Specifically, the SIS team focuses on engagement efforts that align with the values of the United Methodist Church and support the transition to a sustainable global economy. Jake co-chairs the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative, serves on the Climate Crisis Leadership Group for the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and serves on the UN Principles for Responsible Investment Stewardship Advisory Committee. Welcome, Jake.
Happy to be here.
So to get us started off with today's conversation, I'm wondering first, what inspired each of you to devote your time and energy to working toward economic justice? Elizabeth, let's start with you.
Sure, happy to. Well, first, it's just such a pleasure to be with this group for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. My journey in this work really began as a student of economics. I was growing increasingly disillusioned with the sort of dominant assumptions of the discipline and the way we described ourselves as individualistic, rational economic actors. And I really wanted to seek out alternatives that were rooted in a sort of more altruistic notion of human beings. I ended up spending 5 months in Latin America, researching a project called the Economy of Communion, which was started by a Catholic lay organization called the Focolare Movement. It's a network of entrepreneurs that essentially try to implement gospel logic in how they run their companies. And I was really taken with this sort of economic alternative and wrote my dissertation on it. And then a year later, I moved to Italy to work with them as they were launching their first cooperative, and was really compelled by the sort of efficacy and the impact of embracing this sort of alternative economic orthodoxy. I returned to the States and I began working with various organizations and projects in the realm of social finance and impact investing, trying to provide access to capital for those who were typically blocked out from the system, or for those who were starting social enterprises that had a meaningful impact in society.
Great. Jake, how about you? What got you interested in this field of work?
Yeah, I would say I've had a broad interest in the ideas of sustainable investing and impact investing for a number of years. The term justice, I would attribute much of that interest and orientation in myself to different Catholic women religious that I've come across in my work. So previously, before I was with Westpath, I was an institutional investment consultant at Morgan Stanley. And I worked primarily with Catholic women religious. And it was in seeing the work of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility and in collaborating with various women religious through the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative that I saw a focus on justice and a focus on equity that felt a lot more authentic and real to me than the sometimes kind of glossy but somewhat superficial conversations that can happen in broader investment ecosystems. And so, you know, it was really that exposure to people who had been working on this for a long time with a lot of intention that helped orient me to leaving Morgan Stanley and dedicating myself full time to a more faith-based approach within Westpath, which has afforded for more conversations around justice, which I find myself grateful for. So thank you all.
And Kim, how about you? What inspired you to get aligned with this type of work?
So for me, it's encounter. So it's been living with, working with, and accompanying people on the margins in countries around the world and also in the US. So small scale producers, factory workers, people who are homeless in the US and elsewhere. And in spending time with people on the margins and in building relationships, one quickly begins to understand that no matter what the location is, the stories start to sound the same. In other words, people just simply aren't making enough money to live. And yet the products that we purchase, there's a lot of money being made on those products. And so there's a problem here, and it's led me to seek solutions for people on the margins, the people that I have encountered. And I want to just add, you know, Pope Francis in his wisdom has used that word a number of times in his teaching, that, you know, emphasizing the need for encounter. And my experience, I think, bears out his emphasis on that as a starting point.
Kim, your expertise, of course, plays out from the consumer angle of this. What does ethical consumption look like through the lens of our intersectional issues of racism, migration, and climate?
So ethical consumption looks like paying attention to the impact that the things you buy, right, have on the environment, on workers, on producers, and on the vulnerable and marginalized. So are the people that are producing the things that you buy making enough money to live on? Is the production process doing something to destroy the environment? And paying attention to that, and then purchasing goods that are part of creating what we would call the common good, rather than purchasing goods that help to enable the continued marginalization of large populations of people.
Great. Jake and Elizabeth, you both come at this issue from the investment perspective. What does ethical investing look like through the lens of our intersectional issues, racism, migration, and climate? Elizabeth, how about you first?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about becoming aware of how our investments are at work in the world and how they intersect with those issues and whether they're contributing to the ongoing crises that we're grappling with as a society, the inequality, the injustice around racism, the injustice around the climate. All of us in some way, shape, or form move money in the world, whether as consumers or purchasers, much like Kim is speaking to, with retirement accounts, with our savings accounts at different types of depository institutions. We use our money as a tool in the world. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we aware of what that money is doing in the world? And after we become aware, we then can shift to hopefully the aim of doing no harm with our money. So that might entail taking our money out of places where we feel like it might be doing harm, whether it's invested in mutual funds that for the most part, we typically have no idea, what those mutual funds are doing. So starting to move our money is quite a journey. And I've been on that journey personally recently. My family, we just moved all of our money into a local credit union in Detroit where I live. And that was a process of really kind of discerning how even just our money sitting in our savings accounts could do work in the world. Eventually, we want to move to what, through the Francesco Collaborative, what we often call restorative investing, which is where our dollars can directly contribute to building that alternative economy that is different from the status quo. It's really something we draw inspiration from Pope Francis on. It's an economy that really centers these notions of an integral ecology and integral human development rather than centering profit. So in our kind of dominant paradigm, we tend to center profit, and particularly through shareholder wealth maximization at the expense of communities and the environment. So much like Kim is describing, if we can truly sort of integrate the impact of our money and what it has, that the impact it has on the environment, and measure value differently, we can start to gradually move toward restorative investing. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like.
Great. And Jake, what are your thoughts on what ethical investing looks like through the these intersectional issues?
Yeah. So I'll talk about it from two perspectives, kind of macro and micro. At a macro perspective at Westpath, what we have defined is what we term our sustainable economy framework, which is basically the idea that in order to achieve the returns that are commensurate with the expectations and needs of our beneficiaries, we need to see the transition to a sustainable global economy. And that is one that we define as encompassing social cohesion, long-term prosperity for all, and environmental health. And I think if you look at that ethical investing from a long-term perspective, and you look at the pillars that are needed, you need people, you need prosperity for a broad group of people. You need social cohesion in a way that's, when we're talking about the issues that are being discussed, if you see a lot of migration due to climate change, that's fundamentally destabilizing in a lot of ways. If you see racism, there's practical aspects of how diversity helps prosperity by bringing in a lot of perspectives. There's a lot of studies showing that investing in climate mitigation today is going to bear extreme fruit in terms of the mitigation ability later on. So there's all those kind of practical reasons for it. And there's a lot of arguments that can be made about if you stretch out the time frame and you bring in the broad economic macro decisions, these are the right decisions to make for investors. But I'd also say from a micro standpoint, it's about asking yourself questions as to how you want to relate, or where you see and have capacity to bring a focus that's really important to you. So let's use climate crisis as one example. There's often this discussion about should we divest of all fossil fuels, or should we engage with fossil fuel companies? And the thing about that is, I think investors should be doing whatever they have the energy to do within their mission. So the Mercy Sisters spend a lot of time engaging, and it's a lot of work, and they have the capacity to do that work. And they've had incredible impact in that. While other groups, like the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, have divested and been loud about that divestment and have talked about it. And I know individuals of both groups, and they highly respect each other and want to collaborate and work more together because they have the same ultimate goal, and they're bringing their own talents and gifts to whatever that ethical investing looks like. So I think there's so many different channels. I don't want to define it in too narrow a sense, just to say, bring your talents, bring your interests, bring your passions, and you will find ways to express those.
Great. Kim, back to you now. To promote economic justice, I know you've gotten involved in the coffee business, as we briefly discussed in your introduction. Why coffee?
Yeah, I'm in the coffee business as a consumer and as a business person. So coffee is the second largest commodity exported from developing countries, which is an important figure to know because it tells you how important coffee is for people and communities and countries who are economically poor. So there are 25 million small scale farming families globally that are involved in the coffee business. So that's like 100 million people. In addition, we drink a lot of coffee in this country. And there is a lot of money being made in coffee. And what I can tell you is, by and large, that money is not being made by small scale producers, right? That money is being made by exporters, by roasters, by large coffee companies, and to a lesser extent, retailers. And so taking some of that money, that's large sums of money that's being made by other entities in the supply chain, and redistributing it to producers is very impactful on the lives of small scale farming families. And there are a lot of them. So coffee is an impactful product to start with because there are so many people involved and because of where it's grown. There are other products, like cotton or chocolate, for example, is particularly exploitative. So there are other products, but coffee is a good place to start, and it's certainly where I started.
And it seems like a relatively easy fix for the average person too. If you're having coffee in the morning, just thinking about it differently when you're at the store or ordering online can actually have an impact. I love that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's a small step and a big impact. And your coffee purchase literally directly impacts people's lives. Literally. That choice that you make every morning. And I don't want to just focus on coffee only because there are a lot of other products, but it's definitely a good place to start.
So let's talk about risks and benefits. What are the risks and benefits of ethics-based approaches to achieving economic justice? Elizabeth, let's start with you.
So I think even today's ethics-based approaches tend to be pretty prone to short-term thinking in the finance world. And hence they're held accountable to a set of benchmarks or standards that really don't take into account the kind of long-term multi-generational thinking that we need. And again, if we look to Catholic social thought and these notions of integral ecology, we have to acknowledge our deep interconnectedness as human beings and with all of creation. And if we're actually going to steward this planet well, that requires much longer term thinking than we typically employ in the world of finance. So this is why many financial institutions or fund managers tend to struggle with incorporating climate risk into their strategies because they're still held to short-term performance benchmarks. So that really needs to change. But unfortunately, it is sort of the status quo, and most investment advisors and others who are working in this space are held to standards, which is challenging. Another risk, I think, is that this work that we're talking scale in the way that's needed, get entrenched our dominant system is. So we often spend a lot of time on definitions rather than focusing on building the relationships that are really going to be alternatives we seek. So I was struck by what Kim was saying at the beginning about encounter. In our Francesco Collaborative, we run workshops for institutional and individual investors. And what we ask them, and really we talk about this theme of what does it mean to invest in a livable future? And coming out of the workshop, most of what people tell us is this was transformational for me because I had encounters with others who are on a similar path of inquiry. And I no longer feel alone in that work. And I can really start to think about how to build a relationship with those who are creating the future on the ground and figure out how we can partner with them in a true sort of authentic way as an investor. So I think in order to get there, we're going to have to let go of some of our old notions of risk. What's too risky for me? We can talk more about that later too, but I do think a potential shortcoming is that we don't think big enough and we don't allow relationships to really guide our investing.
Yeah, it definitely commands a shift in the way we're thinking about investing. Jake, any further thoughts on risks and benefits, maybe shortcomings of ethics-based approaches?
Yeah, so one of my roles is I'm a member of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and which is a group of asset owners committed to achieving net zero emissions in their portfolio by 2050. And I had the privilege of writing an op-ed with a close collaborator of mine from Allianz, Patrick Pera. And one of the things that we said in that op-ed is, it's become commonplace to talk about climate risk as financial risk. And that's something that you've heard from BlackRock. That's something that it is actually a significant increase in terms of where we were 3 years ago to where we are today. So it's progress. However, something that him and I were really espousing is climate risk is existential risk. This is not something where, I actually don't think our understanding of risk needs to shift in order to prioritize us getting there. I think investors need to have the courage to really consider the downside that we're playing with right now, because it is unprecedented and existential. And that should be enough to motivate the type of unprecedented action that's needed. But as humans, we have biases by which we are going to try to fix the problem using the same tools that have been used to create it. So we're going to look for data, we're going to look for precedent. In finance and investment, you're going to look for the tools that are going to allow you to say, well, what's the real risk of 250 million climate migrants by 2050? What's the risk of racism continuing to be rampant? And because of how complex those issues are, and because of how interconnected those systems are, there is no real ability to measure that in the type of way that finance is comfortable with and has tried to do in the past. And so I think that's part of what is an incredible opportunity, is to try to figure out, like Elizabeth is talking about, how do you help people get comfortable looking at that existential risk and then taking the action that's needed to address it.
Great. And Kim, how about for you, your thoughts on risks and benefits of ethics-based approaches?
Sure, and I'm going to say something about challenges too. I want to start by saying something about both the climate and migration risks around not doing your consumption ethically, because people not making enough money for the thing that they produce is one of the root causes of migration, right? And environmentally unsustainable production, right, is also one of the causes of the climate crisis, as well as migration. So we need to try to convince people to look carefully at the goods that they consume to see how they are impacting both of those things, the populations of people that are producing them, as well as the environment. The challenge is that people in the United States, in my view, are not accustomed to paying the full value of the goods that they consume. They consume them based on exploitative labor and destruction of the environment because it's cheaper. And so people look for low cost, and they shop at companies that are going to give them the lowest cost and look for goods that are going to give them the lowest cost. And it's very hard to move people past that mindset into thinking about a cost that is a longer term cost. We are paying for environmental destruction, maybe not at the cash register in the moment, but in the long term, we're paying for it. And we're also paying for the long-term effects of extreme poverty in developing countries through a massive migration crisis, global migration crisis. So the challenge is to convince people to think bigger than the cash register, and to pay attention to what the impacts are of the things that they buy, directly on the people that are producing them and on the earth that we all live in.
Great. And it's such a complex issue. As you were talking, Kim, I was thinking about the fact that economic justice also ties into the fact that for many families, you know, it's a privilege to be able to think, maybe I buy the more expensive product, because some people are just trying to get by. So it's such a complex system.
It's extremely complex, and yet we don't want to create a system where you have poor people exploiting other poor people.
Right.
Because that's what's happening when people buy goods that are produced using exploitative labor. So
yeah, really good point. Many of us are familiar with the term greenwashing. How prevalent is similar inauthenticity in your industries? And what does authenticity look like in your industry? Jake, let's start with you.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this in other panels. If anybody tells me that they have a plan to get to net zero, then I am immediately skeptical of that person. And so what I would say authenticity looks like is humility and curiosity, because I think that we're just dealing with a really unprecedented transition. I mean, when it comes to climate, you know, effectively the science tells us that in order to have any sort of chance of increase of hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius or net zero by 2050, we have to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. We are currently on track with the nationally determined contributions from multiple agreements to the Paris Agreement to reduce by 1% by 2050. So we're roughly flat instead of cutting by half. And, you know, there's a lot of complex reasons for that. Systems have a lot of inertia. And I saw in the chat somebody saying, you know, how do we convince and have a conversion of heart and mind? There's a quote that I always like of, in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they should until they happen faster than you thought they could. And so I think contemplating how do we create some of those tipping points is really important. But I think that a lot of people are actually being very authentic about trying to wrestle with and trying to move forward on this issue. It's just maybe that their blinders are on too much, or they're looking at it too much within the system in which they exist, because it's just really hard to look at it with the scope and the scale. And I certainly don't do it all the time. That the problem requires. It requires a lot of creativity and courage to look at it bluntly. Yeah,
that's a massive challenge. Elizabeth, any thoughts to add about inauthenticity and authenticity?
Absolutely. I've had various roles over the course of my career in the field of impact investing, where I myself have grappled with whether what I'm doing is truly authentic in terms of the impact that I'm seeking to effectuate. And often I've ended up in a place of cognitive dissonance, which has prompted me to leave or make a shift. And part of that is because there's a dissonance that comes with purporting to use the levers of finance to change the world, to address these really urgent problems, while also holding a portfolio of investments to these sort of conventional market rate standards. It can be quite extractive in nature. So I've been in positions where I've been working with social entrepreneurs, and the strategy relies on a conventional approach to venture capital and the sort of returns that are sought through venture capital. And I think that's really challenging and requires a real reckoning about what we mean by authentic for impact investing. I've over time grown to really see capital as living along a spectrum of returns, and like to avoid trying to put capital in a few boxes. I think that's binary thinking to say, oh, this capital will generate market rate returns. Well, that market rate is determined by many inputs into the market system that might be directly contradictory to our values. So I think what's important is to ask what is fair and to grapple with these questions around fairness and how we fairly balance risk and return. My colleague Felipe and I, as we were working in our last, developing our last Investing in Livable Futures workshop, we used the principles developed by an organization called Transform Finance, which I really recommend anyone who's interested in look into. There's a book that Morgan Simon wrote called Real Impact, which really does a beautiful job sort of articulating some of these struggles around authenticity. And one of our important takeaways from that is that Catholic social teaching really does beckon us to enter into relationship and think about how we can add more value than we extract in a financial transaction. So that's what I would say authentic investing looks like, impact investing. I think back to some of these ideas around risk that we were touching on earlier, I do think we still tend to measure risk primarily through loss of capital. Whereas I'd also say that a more authentic approach might be to figure out how we capture the risk of continuing to invest in ways that perpetuate activities that are environmentally unsustainable or exploitative, and incorporate that risk into our analysis, and then figure out how we can do something that shifts the curve.
Fascinating.
If I could just add one kind of note to that, just on a practical level, recognizing the audience here is a lot of women religious who may be interested in talking to their CFOs. I would say the CFOs who get authentically involved in this are the happiest that I've met in terms of how they're doing it, because they get to be part of the mission and they get to feel connected to what the sisters are doing. And the vast majority of the finance individuals that I've seen that have worked with Catholic women religious do believe in the mission. And if they have skepticism about impact or ethics, it's not because they're not aligned with the sisters. It's just because they don't yet see how this could align with what they see as their primary, fiduciary duty to take care of them and make sure that they have what they need to retire and to be taken care of in terms of healthcare. But ultimately, the CFOs and the chief investment officers, chief financial officers that get there and get authentically involved really feel more meaning and more richness to their lives in my conversations with them. And I think sometimes we have to tell that beneficial story too. That's the upside of, if you can really get involved in this, in my life, it's been incredibly rewarding. And that's part of the hopeful story is, even though there is that dissonance that you struggle with, that's going to exist regardless. And at least you're having a more transparent and healthy conversation with it if you're engaging in some of these questions.
I think you're so right, Jake. And I just wanted to jump in to say, this is where Jake's points around humility and curiosity come in, because so much of this journey, in my experience, has been like an unlearning of our training, right? So if you're trained in a particular way to sort of safeguard your fiduciary duty or what have you, like there are certain approaches you're going to default to. So part of this journey is one of personal transformation as much as it is our collective transformation.
Wow, that is fascinating. And Kim, we know that inauthenticity is an issue on the consumer side as well, the consumer product side rather. What does authenticity look like?
So the problem is there's no regulation really for the words that people use. And there's a lot of buzzwords out there that make, consumers happy, like sustainably sourced, or something along those lines, using the word sustainability in your marketing campaign, or using the word green even in your marketing campaign, or using the word fair in your marketing campaign. And the reality is they can use those words and do whatever they want. And I want to know how much their producers make. That's what I want to know. And try to find that on their website. It can be quite a slog through a lot of layers of web pages to try to figure that out, because most companies are not transparent about that. So for the consumer has to seriously do the work to look past the buzzwords, right? And to figure out exactly what is going on with this company. And it can take some work. And there are some things to look for, like certified fair trade. There is a certification process, or membership in the Fair Trade Federation, because not all fair trade companies are certified, but many of them belong to Fair Trade Federation. There's a Fair Trade Factory symbol that's out there that you can look for. B corporations, products produced by B Corps is another place to look for. B Corps have agreed to a set of social justice and environmental principles. So there are things that you can look for that are actually real to get past the buzzwords.
Okay, great guidance. Let's be honest here, very few of us have unlimited financial resources. So how do we prioritize where we spend or invest our money to maximize our influence? And I know both Elizabeth and Jake, you work with communities. Does it differ if you're investing on behalf of an organization versus an individual? How do we prioritize? Elizabeth, let's start with you.
Oh, darn, I was hoping we could hear from Jake. I'll jump in. This is really Jake's sweet spot as an advisor. But I would say, I mean, the first two things that come to mind are, first, we need to discern and get clear on our values. And that's a journey both individually and collectively as a congregation, as a community, as an organization or institution. We have found Catholic social teaching to be very fertile ground for offering an alternative values framework. The Sustainable Development Goals have emerged as a sort of large overarching framework that can help investors get clear on their values, but Catholic social teaching has been a font of wisdom for myself individually, as well as many of the communities I've worked with. And so getting clear on those values is important. And then the second thing is really recognizing that money can be a tool for repair and reconciliation as well. And I think this is important for institutions, congregations, those who are grappling with histories or legacies that are in need of deep repair or reconciliation. Money can be a grounds on which we can make amends for certain things or reconcile with communities. So I think part of that, as an individual, we shape the market through our consumption patterns, much like Kim is describing to us so beautifully. We also invest in things like retirement accounts or savings with depository institutions. So we can bring a sort of clarity of intention to all of those interactions. There are increasingly socially responsible options available in the marketplace to move your money around in more socially responsible ways. Working with or investing on behalf of a congregation or a community institution is different. You do have different tools at your disposal. Some of that Jake was alluding to earlier in terms of the difference between a shareholder activism approach, where you can gain voting shares through your investment and really try to influence corporate behavior, or in our experience through the Francesco Collaborative, it's really been about helping groups invest directly in projects and cooperative entrepreneurs and emerging fund managers that are trying to really create these alternatives that prioritize the dignity of work, that really address concerns around racial equity and sort of espouse these values that we see expressed through Catholic social teaching.
Great. Jake, it sounds like she filled us in on a lot of it, but any further thoughts on how we prioritize?
Oh, I think Elizabeth covered the ground very well. I would just say, I would say also start local at times. I feel like sometimes there's a comfort with like trying to find an impact investing in a developing country or looking for a microfinance project in the Southeast Asia, and there's more hesitancy to look for a community development financial institution that's in your own backyard. And the wonderful thing about the community development financial institution that's in your own backyard, if you vet it and you find it's a strong institutional partner, is that that'll give you the greater opportunity for the type of encounter that Kim was talking about earlier, because that will be part of your community now potentially. And I think that has ability to have a transformative change on a personal level in a different way.
Wonderful. And Kim, your thoughts on how we prioritize as consumers?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say about it. One is, one of the problems is that there is a vast division between what heads of companies make and the rest of us make. And that vast division is supported by tax policy. So that CEOs and upper level management are incentivized in a sense because they pay a very low tax rate to pay themselves a lot and their workers significantly less. One of the solutions is to even that out so that we don't have a system where poor people are exploiting other poor people because they can't afford to buy products that cost a little more. And instead, we're increasing people's incomes on both sides by increasing what producers make who are producing the product and also increasing what workers make because we can't count on CEOs to lower their own salaries, right? But we can do it through tax policy. And that's getting to a different question, but it's part of the solution here. And then I would also just say especially for low income people, this can be very challenging, but to start with one product or two products and to shop locally instead of with giant multinational corporations where the CEO is making 4,000 times the worker, and instead support the local economy, locally owned businesses, small businesses where people are at a completely different level in terms of how much money they make. So that's where I would start small.
All great suggestions. I want to dive down deeper into the policy question, and I'm wondering, Kim, if you have anything to add in addition to what you just spoke about, but what needs to happen for our country to effectively work toward economic justice, and what policies should we be engaging in right now?
So yeah, I've given my speech on tax policy already. I kind of preempted the next question. I think it's crucial, and it's in conversation right now. We've seen this vast division between the haves and the have-nots in this country only grow larger since the 1970s, and that's largely as a result of tax policy. Right, because of all of these tax cuts on people who have very, very large incomes. And at one time, it simply was not allowed in this country. And for us to see real economic justice, we've got to start there, because we can't assume that people are just going to lower their own salaries. They're not going to. Mm-hmm. So except for us, we are. Right. And those of us who are trying very hard to live our lives based on Catholic teaching, we are. Right. But we can't count on everyone else to do it. We've got to incentivize it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially when people are operating under an entirely different set of values and coming towards these issues from those values. Elizabeth, I saw you nodding your head. Any further thoughts on policy, what we should be engaging in right now, and what needs to happen in our country to effectively work toward economic justice?
Absolutely. Well, on a separate but related note, I did want to just call attention to what's happening today on the Hill with the reconciliation bill. There are a number of efforts to slash very important funding for care. This is something I work on in a day job. Home and community-based services dollars, aging with dignity, these dollars are threatened. And so if anyone is interested, I would highly recommend calling your representatives and trying to articulate your support for those funds. On the topic of impact investing, I think there is a lot to be done to advocate for ongoing support for the Community Development Finance Institution Fund, the Capital Magnet Fund, the National Housing Trust Fund. Those are three kind of dominant fund structures we have at the federal level to try and invest in community development. I know many sisters have been vital in investing in CDFIs and community development finance institutions and bringing that industry along. The U.S. Impact Investing Alliance has a lot of really great recommendations for how to kind of contribute to positive policies in this direction. I did want to call attention to one specific policy proposal that's underway right now, which is the Capital for Cooperatives Act that was introduced in May by Senator Hickenlooper in Colorado to try and level the playing field for cooperative businesses to access financing through the Small Business Administration. Currently, the SBA requires a personal or entity guarantee to access financing, which is just incompatible with the cooperative business model. So this Capital for Cooperatives Act would address that, and I would encourage folks to follow that.
Great. Jake, anything to add as far as policy goes, what we should be keeping our eyes on, what we should be engaging in, and what needs to happen?
I think from my perspective, the main way that I'm engaging on policy is just trying to get back to that humility and courage piece when it comes to, you've actually seen a broad expansion in terms of commitments to net zero, both from the corporate and the financial institution side. So it's been a real hockey stick moment in terms of the growth in those. And something that we're doing at Westpath is just engaging corporations and financial institutions to say, how are you actually lobbying and aligning yourself with what you've said you want to achieve? And I think that there's just some catch up that needs to happen and some accountability in terms of making sure that there is authenticity to this and trying to approach people with a good faith effort of saying, you've said this, we understand that there's no clear roadway, but we need to see that you're being constructive in these specific conversations, like a clean electricity standard, and asking utilities to put their weight behind it because we think it's necessary to decarbonize the power grid. So it's really about that alignment piece is where we're focusing at Westpath.
Great. And I know some of you have been answering audience questions as they've been popping up and as we've been moving along. I do have one question that we haven't addressed. Kim, this is specific to some of your thoughts. You had mentioned that we need to convince people to think bigger than the cash register. The question is, how do we do that? Any thoughts from anyone?
So meaning how do we shop ethically?
Well, how do we start that conversation and convince people to think bigger than the price?
So I'll start just by going back to Encounter. I do think that if we as ministers in the church design programs, design experiences of encounter, people with and among people who are impacted by economic injustices, right, on the border or in environmentally destroyed areas or other places in the world that are impacted by low salaries. So if we design those encounters so that people have the opportunity to develop relationships and to hear stories from people on the margins, both in the US and elsewhere, who are impacted by this, that is what's transformational, is relationship. That's where it starts, is when we enter into relationship with people who are impacted. And I feel like in this country, we're so divided, and people who live on the margins in this country are very isolated from people who do not. And Pope Francis talks about inclusion as a key for ending poverty. And it's true. People who live on the margins want to be included in the economic benefits that everyone else gets. And it's hard to really grasp that unless you've had that encounter. So I do think that's where we start, and all of us are part of the church and have opportunities to create that type or participate in that type of experience where we can have those encounters. Great. And then, I mean, I can give some examples of places where you can buy stuff, but I think that's not what you're looking for.
No, I think your answer was perfect. Jake and Elizabeth, this feeds into a point that Kim made, but the question is for you. Is the CEO compensation to the average worker income for a company a helpful measure to help guide our investments? And if not, what guideposts would you recommend?
So there's a group called Just Capital And they do some good research in terms of the equity elements of different corporations. So honestly, I would say that I would defer to some of the work that they did, because especially after COVID-19, with all the focus on the role of workers, I was impressed with the research that they came out with.
Great. Elizabeth, anything to add?
I think pay equity is certainly a helpful indicator if that data is available to you. I think in my experience working as an investor, we've also used gender and race representation, especially at the senior management level, as one indicator of sort of company responsibility. I think that the kind of indicators you want to seek and hold yourselves accountable to depend also in large part on the kind of impact you want to affect in the world, which derives from those values we talked about earlier. So it really is this kind of journey of discernment as to what you want your money to do in the world. So for example, in the realm of education, where I was investing beforehand, we used a number of metrics pertaining to making education tools and resources accessible to at-risk communities, right? And so you can understand in some ways where a company's intentions are in terms of who they seek to sell to. So it's really, in many ways, depends on the context and is very case by case. But this is something, this kind of goal of how you discern your investments, building an investment decision-making framework is something that we're doing work with through the Francesco Collaborative, because we recognize that it is quite personal in many ways, and ideally it will trickle up to a sort of broader set of global standards to ensure that we are making progress on these important issues around the climate and other things.
Wonderful. In what ways have each of you seen measurable evidence that these approaches work? Kim, let's start with you.
So my measure is on how much money producers make, and connected to that, are they able to support their families on it? So that's my measure for success for the companies that I'm engaged in. And we essentially, the price that we pay them for coffee ensures that it's built into the design. So, and we have accepted less money for ourselves in order to do that. So that's my measure for success. Can they pay for their kids to go to school, right? Can they put food on the table? Can they live a life in dignity the way that we understand it, which is having their basic needs met? And that's my measure for success. And when people make enough money, they can. And they don't migrate, because in the end, people tend to want to stay in the place where they feel comfortable with their family and their culture and their community and their history. They just need to be able to support their families in a dignified way.
Yeah, absolutely. Jake and Elizabeth, in what ways have you seen measurable evidence that these ethics-based approaches work?
So answered in two ways. In impact investment, the definition from the Global Impact Investing Network is measurable social and environmental returns alongside financial returns. So you can, if you're doing a lot of impact investing, you can see, renewable energy generated, decent jobs created, emissions avoided. So there's that kind of quantification element certainly in it. Gets more complex when you start talking about stewardship at a global scale. So I think that my measure of success in those contexts has to be a lot more qualitative regarding, are these actions starting to create less dissonance and more authenticity within the conversations we're having, which is always going to have a heavily qualitative element to it. And then, I would say, answering, kind of addressing a question I saw in the chat regarding avoiding voyeurism, one measure of success, if you're looking to be in relationship and in solidarity, is just, do you feel like you formed an authentic relationship with someone in the community? So what Kim and Elizabeth are talking about, and what I've experienced in small part, is just, you avoid voyeurism by going in transparent and humble and with a commitment to showing up consistently and to potentially being told to go away and potentially being told that it's not your place. And so I think a measure of success, though, is that you start to form relationships with different people that are outside of your normal scope that help to enrich your thinking. And that's the part about diversity and these different encounters that I think is a real positive to be spoken to, is just, that it broadens your own perspective and makes your own life more rich. That's a measure of success.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
I don't have really much to add to Jake's points around evidence and measurement. I think he's right on sort of the balance between quantitative and qualitative measures, but I want to build on his last point on solidarity and just share a story. We had a fund manager focused on employee ownership conversions that we profiled in our last Investing in Local Futures workshop. And so this fund is working with retiring business owners to help them transition ownership to their workers. Beautiful mission. And the fund was led by 2 Black fund managers who had been out fundraising for quite some time, were struggling to get traction, and felt like the only way they were getting traction was to sort of tout their pedigree, their training, their educational credentials, et cetera. And they started working with faith-based investors, particularly women's religious congregations, who ended up making some very catalytic investments in their fund. And what they said to me the other day was, it was in those conversations that we felt like we could show up as our authentic selves. We could actually be in relationship with them as investors. And that was the most meaningful part of our fundraising journey. And so I think the impact certainly was quantitative in that those initial investments helped catapult them to raise and succeed in reaching their sort of, goal for their first fund close. But the impact was also qualitative or immeasurable in that it allowed them to really show up as their full selves in the work that they're doing. And you can't really quantify that. That just goes a really long way. And that's encounter right there.
That's a perfect example. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about voyeurism before we run out of time, because it's such a good question and such an important point. And what I want to say is encounter and relationship is not the same thing as poverty tourism, right? It's not taking a group of people, going in, looking, like building something or doing some act of service and then leave, and then you never think about it again. You did your service for whatever reason you did your service. That's more like poverty tourism. And what I'm talking about is long-term relationship, long-term commitment, and starting with hearing and listening to the voices of the communities that you're inserting yourself into, and finding out why on earth they would even want you there. And they might not, if it's too much trouble, they might not if you're having honest conversations, but they might if they feel like together in partnership, their lives might actually have a chance of being changed, right? And the reality is, so will our lives be changed. So this sense of mutuality, it has to be built into the experience, that there's a sense of mutual transformation, that it's not just we're coming in and using poor people for our own spiritual growth. And instead, we're designing a long-term relationship, a long-term partnership, and a relationship that's mutually transformative. And that can be done, in my experience, and it's amazing. It's amazing, and it's also a lot of work.
I am hearing throughout this whole conversation the importance of being humble, and that in itself seems like a sea change that is necessary in our country for sure. So I would like to thank all of our audience members who submitted questions for our panelists, and we're sorry we're not able to get to all of your questions, but we welcome you to continue the conversation on our Facebook page. With a better understanding of the topic of economic justice, it's time to talk about next steps. Each of our panelists have provided suggested action items to help us as we move forward. Jake, let's start with you. Tell us about your action item.
Yeah, I've just heard a lot of stories of people that have tried to engage in this conversation about aligning their money with their values and kind of asking this open-ended question. And I think it's a wonderful place to start in terms of seeing if there's mutuality in the interest of exploring that. And the only thing I'd add to that is if you get a firm no because the individual that you're working with is grounded in more traditional mindsets, there are other people out there you can work with. So the best Catholic, the Catholic women religious that I worked with, it was almost always driven by the leadership going to their CFOs or going to their advisors and very clearly stating, this is a question that there is not the option to say, that's not possible. We are going to align with our values, and so make it happen. And so I would encourage all of the individuals on this line, whether that's a conversation with your own financial advisor or with somebody who manages money on behalf of an institution that you're responsible for, to have some courage and conviction in pushing on that.
Great. Elizabeth, tell us about your action item. And Elizabeth?
Amen to what Jake said. There are 3 things I wanted to highlight. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's coming in and out.
Okay, it says my internet is unstable, so hopefully you can hear me. One thing is to subscribe to a newsletter that we just launched through the Francesco Collaborative. It's called Ownership Matters, and it educates on the solidarity economy. The next thing for me simply was just to encourage you to join a local cooperative if you haven't already. We have found that cooperatives are deeply embodying of Catholic social teaching, and there's plenty of opportunity to invest in and support them. And then we are running our next Investing in Livable Futures workshop January 10th to February 18th. So we are going to have info sessions coming up in November and would love to see anyone who's interested there. So I'm going to drop my email in the chat here for anyone who's interested in following up.
Perfect. And
sorry, Chair, it's just I'll get in trouble with my board if I don't do this. Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative, catholicimpact.org is a great organization to learn more and collaborate with other institutions. I'll put the link in the chat. Thank you.
Perfect. And of course, we'll have much of this information on our website, exploringintersections.org. Kim, tell us about your action item.
So I'm promoting other people's organizations, not my own, but maybe I'll put my own in the chat too while I'm at it. But learn more about tax policy. I've talked about how hugely important it is for economic justice in this country. Network Lobby, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has workshops on tax policy that highlights the importance of tax policy and its connection to our anti-racism work in particular. So Network Lobby, you can just go to their website and learn more. And then fair trade, some of you probably already buy fair trade products. I would say if you already buy some, buy another one. So add one more to your monthly fair trade purchase. And you can learn a lot about fair trade from the Fair Trade Federation, which is an umbrella organization in the US and Canada for fair trade companies, most of them very, very small. So these are small nonprofit and for-profit companies that are working very, very hard for their producers to make a decent living. And so you can just learn a lot about what's out there on the Fair Trade Federation and increase your purchases. My companies are justhaiti.org and consciouscoffees.com.
Perfect. Thank you all, Jake, Elizabeth, and Kim, for your calls to action, for your insights and your thoughts on economic justice.
Thanks so much.
Thank you also to the incredible team of professionals working behind the scenes to bring this program to life every month. Next month on Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate, we discuss food security. According to the United Nations Committee on World Food Security means that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to safe, nutritious food that meets their dietary needs for an active and healthy life. We all know that isn't the world's reality. How do we get there? And what steps can each of us take to further the cause? We'll explore those questions and more in our next conversation on October 13th. I hope you will join us. Thank you for being here today. This series is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Visit our website, exploringintersections.org, to find resources mentioned in today's conversation or to register to attend our next program. We broadcast live every second Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. You can also download podcasts of our panel discussions from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or via our website. And be sure to connect with us for the continuing conversation on Facebook. I'm Cherish Badzinski. Thanks for tuning in to Exploring Intersections.